On May 2nd, 1995, Kiplyn Davis disappeared from her high school without a trace. She left all her belongings in her locker and showed no signs of running away. At the time, they didn't realize this case would never be completely closed, and to this day, this case is considered a solved, no-body case. Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. I'm your host Lulu, and today is part 2 of the Kiplyn Davis case. Last time we talked about the circumstances of her disappearance and the events that surrounded it. Today we're going to talk about the charges and the theories that surround this case. And I want you to remember, her body still has not been found, even to this day. These charges are based off of the information that they have gathered throughout this case, not the information gathered off of her body. The charge we're going to start with was on August 11th, 2005. A man named Gary Blackmore was indicted on charges of lying about the case. Blackmore and Olsen had actually met at a party in 1995, where Olsen was seen flirting with Blackmore's girlfriend. And when Blackmore approached Olsen to try to get him to back off and stop, because obviously that's his girlfriend, he responded to him by saying that he had attacked a young girl years ago and gotten away with it. And if he knew it was good for him, he would stop asking him to back off. And, of course, Blackmore didn't take that information to the police when he learned of it. He just kind of kept it hidden. And when an FBI agent had came to him during the investigation and asked him if he had ever heard of somebody confessing Kiplyn Davis, he actually lied to the FBI agent. The proof that he lied came out later, obviously. And during court, he said that he was afraid Olsen would retaliate against him if he had confessed to what he heard. Which is a little weird if you think about it, because Leifson threatened Olsen years prior about putting his name into the case. And now we're getting stories that Olsen was threatening other people with information that he knew and was involved in the case. And then on September 26th, 2005, Olsen was arrested with his direct link to her disappearance. This is where a lot more weird information started coming out. Jepsen was actually indicted on October 31st, 2005 because he provided a conflicting alibi for the other suspects in this case. At the beginning of the investigation, he had actually told authorities that the boys and himself were installing sprinklers the day of the disappearance. But then he changed his story later on that they were actually in the auditorium getting ready for a play. Here's another time that I don't understand how the authorities did not quickly realize that their alibi about being in the auditorium was a lie. They had proof early on that Jepsen had already lied about his alibi, but they still just took the boy's word for it and didn't investigate any farther on their alibi. And then, on November 14th of 2005, Leifson was then indicted on charges of denying that he had an argument with Olsen about the case. This is where the threat that he made to Olsen came to light. He was mad that Olsen was telling others, including the police, that he was involved in the Kiplyn Davis case and her death. He actually threatened to shoot him in the head if he ever put his name back into the case. He is reported in telling him that he better keep his mouth shut and stop telling people that he was involved. Here's where I have a little bit of a differing opinion than a lot of people. I'll have a lot of people tell me that Leifson had to be the one that did it. But I just want you to think about Olsen's actions for a minute. Olsen wrote the statement that Leifson was involved. Yes. Olsen also was telling people that he personally was involved in her death. That is also true. But when Leifson found out Olsen put his name in the case, he got mad and threatened him. But can you imagine if you had nothing to do with the case and then somebody decided to bring you in on it? What if Olsen is the only one responsible? I just really want you to think about that for a minute and everything we've talked about. We'll get more into that at the end of the case when we get into our theories. Because I promise you, we're not done with these charges. In December of 2005, a man named Scott Bruson pleaded guilty of perjury and 2 counts of making false statements to the authorities. Bruson had come to the authorities 10 years after the disappearance of Kiplyn and said Olsen had asked him on May 2nd, 1995, the day of her disappearance, that if anybody asked him, he and the other boys were re-roofing a shed together, which is a third conflicting alibi for these boys. But once again, Olsen is the one that's doing all the planning. At least everything that I have seen points to all the planning and premeditation to Olsen. And then they brought up documents that had been filed multiple times in 2006 of people stating to the authorities that Olsen had confessed to multiple people that he raped, murdered, and made Kiplyn disappear. I'm not sure if these statements also bring Leifson back into the story. I could not find anything about that. And now we hit the dates where they were actually charged with something. We're gonna go through these next points pretty fast because there's not really a lot to talk about them. In January of 2006, Blackmore was charged and pleaded guilty of perjury and 1 count of making false statements to the authorities. January 19th, 2006, Olsen was charged with first-degree murder. July 19th, 2006, Olsen was then charged with 15 counts of perjury. The trials for the other men were still going on at this point, and in October of 2006, Olsen told authorities he would take them to Kiplyn Davis's body. They went up the canyon and followed Olsen every step of the way, but it was like he was taking them on a wild goose chase, and they actually came back empty-handed. Police believe at this point that Olsen was making up the fact that he knew where her body was, and that this was just another wild goose chase, and he never knew where Kiplyn was buried. Then we jump to about a year later. September 7th, 2007, Jepson was charged with 1 count of perjury and 3 counts of making false statements to the authorities. He was also charged with first-degree murder here as well. On October 29th, 2007, Leifson was charged with only 1 count of perjury. Then, in April of 2008, they conducted a 6-week search around Spanish Fork River Park in Spanish Fork Canyon. They had some leads that this is where she was at, but once again they left that canyon empty-handed. Then, for our last charge, on May 6th, 2009, Jepson pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, and the prosecutors actually dropped his murder charges, now believing that they did not have enough proof that he murdered Kiplyn Davis. During the multiple court hearings for the boys, Olsen had claimed that David Leifson was at the scene of the crime. Also, he claimed to other people in the past that they had both taken Kiplyn up the canyon that day, and they were together. Prosecutors have statements from unidentified witnesses stating that they knew Kiplyn had been taken up the canyon, raped, murdered, and her body had been buried in an unidentified location. When Olsen was asked if he knew where the body was, his attorney was actually the one who answered that question. He informed the courts that Olsen did not know where the location of Kiplyn Davis's body was. Which now, if you think about it, is yet another lie in the case, because he had told authorities he knew where she was, and he had helped hide her body. Unless maybe she was moved. Just when you think this case couldn't add anything else into it, in 2011, Olsen changed his story once again. Olsen declined to say anything about the crimes or the change in story, and instead let his attorney do all of the talking. The attorney informed everybody that Olsen and an unnamed person met up with Kiplyn on May 2nd, 1995, to drive up Spanish Fort Canyon. Once up Spanish Fort Canyon, Kiplyn and this unnamed person walked off and out of sight. Olsen then waited about 35 to 45 minutes alone until he heard them arguing. At this point, he decided to go off and look for them. When he stumbled across Kiplyn and this unnamed person, he witnessed this unnamed person hit Kiplyn over the right side of her head with a rock about the size of a softball twice. When he ran over to see if Kiplyn was okay and asked the unnamed person what he was doing, all this unnamed person responded with was he needed help hiding her body. At this point, Olsen's attorney claimed that Olsen was unsure whether Kiplyn was still alive at this point. At this point, the boys then drug her body under a line of trees, got into the vehicle they drove up in, and left. Later that night, the boys decided that that body was not hidden. She was just under a line of trees after all. They decided to go back up Spanish Fort Canyon and re-hide her body. By the time they got back up there, it was clear that she was dead. The whole time that this story was getting told, they never once said who this unnamed person was. But a lot of people feel like they know who this unnamed person is. After all, Olsen wrote that statement years ago that named the person involved, right? And from this point, the case stopped. They had charged some people with charges. Every single one of the boys involved got charged with perjury. And Olsen accepted a plea deal for a lesser sentence because of what his charges were. So the only person involved is in prison to this day is Olsen. This case is considered a solved no-body case because of all of the information leading up to these charges, but they still have never found her body. The searches for Kiplyn Davis still continue to this day. And just in 2020, the people that run the cold case of Kiplyn Davis decided that maybe in order to find her, they had to take a completely different turn. While they were going over all of the previous information in the case, they found a connection to Chad Daybell. Chad Daybell is currently involved in some other crimes. He just got charged with murdering his ex-wife and assisting his current girlfriend with the murder of their 2 children. This is still an ongoing case, so I'll have to cover that another day in another story. But Chad Daybell knew one of the boys that was involved in her disappearance, which then led them to wonder if maybe Chad Daybell was involved. Daybell was actually a cemetery worker at the Spanish Fork Cemetery at the time of her disappearance. They were wondering if maybe the boys had something to do with it, and then they called Chad Daybell, and he helped them hide her body. They thought maybe he had buried her in one of the other caskets at the cemetery, with another body, of course. And the Utah Cold Case Coalition actually got their hands on a ground-penetrating radar. This is usually used by law enforcement to search for buried bodies, but it's become a lot more affordable in these years to other groups. It's now 2021. This is a year after they had conducted this in the Spanish Fork Cemetery to see if they could find Kiplyn Davis, and I couldn't find any other information on this, which leads me to believe that they didn't find anything credible or at all at the cemetery. But that brings another really interesting twist in this story. There are so many things surrounding this case that just make you wonder, what if Chad Daybell had something to do with it? Even if it was just like solidifying a thought in one of these boys' heads. So this is where we're going to get into some of the theories. Obviously, the main theory is that Leifson and Olsen took Kiplyn Davis up Spanish Fork Canyon, raped and murdered her, and hid her body together. But in my opinion, there's a lot of little things that maybe discredit this. Olsen could have not really wanted to lead them to the body when he took them up Spanish Fork Canyon. He could have wanted to do a wild goose chase of some kind. But some things just got passed down here where this case had happened that stated that if you are in prison for murder and there is no body, you are not able to go up for parole until you lead authorities to the body. Which I love that. I think that is a fabulous idea. I don't think you should ever give somebody the option to hide the body and still go up for parole and get out. So that means that Olsen's sentence is still going. He was up for parole this year and it got denied because they didn't know where the body is. So he still is serving at least 5 more years in prison. But what about all the other boys involved? Here's where one of my theories comes in. Maybe that's true. Maybe they did go up Spanish Fork Canyon together. She got raped and murdered and hidden. And then when Olsen wrote that statement to the police, Leifson kind of freaked out, threatened Olsen. And then when all of this came down and they got taken to court, Olsen pleaded guilty, but Leifson didn't. So the minute he got out, what if he went up and moved her body? That would make sense. Why, when Olsen was up there leading authorities to her body, he could not find her body? What if it wasn't a wild goose chase, and what if she was no longer there, where he thought? And then we have another theory that I used to hear growing up in school. It's the exact same thing, that, she got taken up there by 2 men, raped and murdered, and hidden. But then the story changed to she was cut up and placed in some toolboxes and buried in multiple different locations so they would never be able to find her full body. I also heard a differing story that she was put into one truck box, that the vehicle they took up Spanish Fork Canyon when they went back up there to hide her body was a truck, and it was Jepson's truck, which is why he was at the house that night. And when they went up there and loaded her body, they moved locations up Spanish Fork Canyon than where it had happened. And as a group, they buried that body up there in a truck box. I'm not sure how I feel about this theory though. I definitely feel like somebody would have noticed that his truck box just disappeared, and I feel like that would have been noted somewhere. But again, the police in this case obviously did not pay attention to some details. Otherwise, very early on, especially when they had 2 false alibis already for these boys, that they could not have ever been at the school. There was also another theory that one of the boys' fathers was involved. I cannot remember which father was involved in this theory, but the theory was that, the same thing happened up Spanish Fork Canyon, raped and murdered her, put her body under a lining of trees, and then they went home to one of the houses. That's where they told the father what had happened, and he did not want his children getting caught. They were young kids at that point. They made a mistake, in his mind. So he told the boys to lead him to the body, and when he got there, he loaded the body up in his vehicle, took her out of Spanish Fork Canyon, and then dumped her on a construction site where he was pouring concrete himself early the next morning, and then he poured concrete over her. And they built this business over top of her. When I was first told this theory, they told me what building it was. I can't remember to this day. Like I said, it's been a very long time. But I actually remember going home and looking up when that building was built, and it didn't line up with the dates. It was built years after she went missing, and so unless he had known it was going to be a project, dug a hole, put her in it, crossed his fingers nobody ever dug her out, and then poured concrete over her, I don't think that one has any truth to stand on. And then what if Chad Daybell was involved? I feel like that's a very far-fetched theory, but I do love the idea that they are opening their minds up to different things. In my personal opinion, I don't know if she'll ever be found now. It's been so long that if she is up a canyon, her body might be long gone, strewn apart by animals, and we might never find her. But I do feel like maybe the reason we haven't found Kiplyn Davis is because everybody is so stuck on this idea that this is the right story, that she has to be up Spanish Fort Canyon. But what if she's not? That's another thing that I wonder. If you did have something to do with it, say, you killed somebody, for example, and everybody was convinced that this person was in one place, like Spanish Fort Canyon, but really, what if she's up Provo Canyon? Are you ever going to correct anybody on that? Why? Why would you correct anybody? At that point, you would just go along with it, and then everybody will always be looking in the wrong spot for her, instead of where she actually is. What if that's the case in this case? What if they never went up Spanish Fort Canyon? What if they went up Provo Canyon? What if they didn't even go to a canyon? That's my thing. There's a million other things I don't understand. Why everybody is so stuck on the idea that that's where she has to be, and that this is the right story. Because really, think about it. What if it's not the right story? And then early on, we find out Olsen was threatened by Leifson. And he changed his story. And still to this day, he will not say who that unnamed person was. So who's to say that somebody didn't threaten him? What if somebody threatened him that he had to take the fall for it, and this was the story he had to say, and he's just been doing that all these years? What if he's afraid of this other person, and it has nothing to do with any of these boys? This is why I'm not sure if this case is actually 100% solved yet. Something happened to her. I am convinced of that. I do not think that she just ran away. I do think something happened to her. But there's so many little things that I'm I just don't understand. The scene of the murder had to have happened in walking distance. They drove their vehicle up there. They parked it and walked away from it. They didn't go far. According to the stories, they didn't have any ATVs or any off-roading vehicles, so it has to be walking distance. The scene of the murder had to have happened in somewhere that they could walk. And I've listened to cases now where somebody has moved a woman, a man who's double her size has moved a woman, and he has gotten injuries from picking her up and carrying her for long periods of time. So these boys could not have drug her very far from the scene of the accident because they had no wounds. Maybe they did and they never got recorded. But even loading her into a car, they would have hurt something, pulled a muscle. You know what I mean? I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me. If they could move her for long periods of time and walk away with no injury, when there are cases to this day where men double the size of women will carry them for, 30 minutes, and they still come away with an injury. We have to remember these boys were in high school. They're not going to know all of the proper ways to hide a body and to carry somebody and decomposition. And I just feel like there is no way that a high school boy or two was able to hide a body so well, unless they had somebody else helping them, unless this was premeditated. And then we can bring the Chad Daybell thought back in. I don't know, but maybe he was helping, because he could have carried her without much of a problem. He could have hit her body, and he could have also threatened the boys to the point where Olsen would be too afraid to say what actually happened. But then we go back to the Jepson situation. He knocked on Kiplyn Davis's family's house and told them he had nothing to do with her disappearance. I feel like the only time you would do that is as if you had something guilty on your mind. Maybe he didn't kill her, but maybe he had information. But then he got scared and left, because if somebody else was helping them and he was drugged into it, he would have gotten threatened too. So maybe it is the right story. Maybe she's still up there somewhere, but I don't know if she is. I honestly don't think she's up Spanish Fork Canyon anymore. Even if that is where it happened, and she was there at the beginning, I feel like anybody's gonna get scared, especially when there's police searching the area that she's at. I think that if she is somewhere, it's not there, and they're not going to tell anybody where she is. And maybe Olsen doesn't know where she is, because she was moved without him being aware, because he's the weak link who's going to tell somebody. But I also don't think that that's the right story, or not all of it, because if Olsen knows where the body is and he's not taking the police to her, something else happened to her up that canyon, and I think her bones will prove that. Olsen has already been charged with manslaughter and served time for it, so even if they found her, he could not be charged for that again. But he could be charged with a number of other things that could put him away for the rest of his life. Especially if something worse happened to her up that canyon. Because another rumor I heard was that every single boy in this case was involved, and they gang raped her and tortured her. Which I hope to God that that is not the case. A lot of people think that they have the right boys. They think Olsen took the fall because he's afraid of that unnamed person who actually killed Kiplyn Davis. If you ask a lot of people around Spanish Fork that know about this case, they will tell you that that unnamed person has to be Leifson. They will also tell you that that had to be what happened. Everybody is convinced that that is what happened to her. And then another weird thing is the only person out of every single one of these boys that got charged that has been ruled out of this tangled mess was Jepson. The police believe that he does have nothing to do with it. But then why did he show up at Kiplyn's dad's house one day? What if we have it all wrong? Maybe these boys are involved, but what if the story is completely wrong, and that's why we've never been able to find Kiplyn Davis? She deserves to be found. She deserves justice, and so does her family. Let's bring this story back to light. Let's get it circulating. Let's get it talked about again. I'm going to give you a very quick rundown of the suspects in this case to help you make your own decision about who you think did it, if any of them did, and what you think happened. Let's start with Timmy Brent Olsen. He was a former classmate of Kiplyn's. He had told police that he watched somebody kill Kiplyn and assisted in hiding her body. But during trial in 2006, multiple witnesses came forward and claimed that he had told them that he was actually the one that was responsible and that he had raped, killed, and hid her body up Spanish Fork Canyon. He was then charged with manslaughter in 2011 and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He pleaded guilty to lying to a grand jury. When he was 33, he took a plea deal in 2011 that he did not have to reveal where the body was located. The Davis family agreed to the plea deal just to get some sort of resolution. He just had a parole hearing in 2021. His attorney informed him that he had given as much information to the location of Kiplyn's body as he could years ago and had no more information to give. Governor Spencer Cox signed a bill that stated convicted murderers cannot gain parole until they have given enough information to find the body. So his parole was denied, and he will spend at least another 5 years in prison. David Rucker Leifson. He was a classmate of Kiplyn Davis. He was actually in her drama group. He pleaded guilty to lying to a grand jury, and he lied about an argument he had had with Olsen. He was mad Olsen had told others he was involved in Kiplyn Davis's death and threatened to shoot him in the head. Christopher Neil Jepson. He was a classmate in her drama class as well. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and was charged with lying to a grand jury and making false statements. He had lied about where Kiplyn Davis was buried. He was also accused of telling people that he was involved in killing Kiplyn, or changing his story every once in a while and saying that he was the one who witnessed Kiplyn get murdered and hide the body. There are also statements proving that the rumor that she was under a construction site started here, because he claimed that that is where she was. Then he lied to authorities about ever saying it when they questioned him about it. He also provided another false and conflicting alibi for the boy. At first, stating they were installing sprinklers together the day of the disappearance, then changed his story, claiming that they were actually in the high school auditorium getting ready for a school play together. But authorities have ruled him out about being involved in the murder or up the canyon that day with Kiplyn. Then we have two other people that you hear are charged but don't get a lot of information as to why. Scott Brunson. He pleaded guilty to lying to a grand jury, lying to a federal agent, and creating a false alibi. He came forward 10 years after the disappearance and informed authorities that Olsen had asked him on May 2nd, 1995, that if anybody asked him, he and the others were re-roofing a shed together, creating another conflicting alibi. And Gary Blackmore, who was not a classmate of Kiplyn's. He pleaded guilty to lying to a grand jury and lying to a federal agent. He lied when asked if he had ever heard somebody confess to killing Kiplyn, when he, in fact, had Olsen confess it to him years prior. And then we come to the black sheep, Chad Daybell, who is currently involved in the disappearance and murder of his girlfriend's 2 children and murdering his ex-wife. He knew the family of one of the boys involved in Kiplyn Davis's disappearance and worked at Spanish Fork Cemetery at the time of her disappearance. The bad thing is, every single one of these boys got charged with perjury, which now means that they cannot be used as a reliable witness in court. So if any information comes up, none of them can testify against one another, even if it is proven that they were all up the canyon together. Kiplyn Davis deserves justice. She does not deserve to be forgotten. And she does not deserve to be up a canyon cold somewhere, waiting for somebody to find her body. It's heartbreaking that this 15-year-old girl could be gone and just forgotten. Once again, Kiplyn Davis went missing from her Spanish Fork High School, May 2nd, 1995. She was born July 1st, 1979, and was 15 at the time of her disappearance. She is a white female who stands at 5'3" and was 110 pounds when she disappeared. She has red hair and blue eyes. She is also reported with having a small birthmark on the back of her neck. Even though authorities are pretty sure she is dead, she is still considered a missing and endangered person. If you know any information that has not been brought to light in this case, call the Spanish Fork Police at 801-804-4700. Who do you think's responsible? Do you think they charged the right men? Do you think she's even up Spanish Fork Canyon? And how in the world did high school students murder and hide a body and get away with it? I guess we won't know the full truth until we find Kiplyn Davis. Let's bring her home together. She deserves that. There may be false or misleading information throughout this podcast. All facts have been researched to the best of my abilities, but accidents do happen. If this is a story you are interested in knowing more about, I highly recommend doing your own research. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.